All right. Hosea chapters 9 and 10 will be our area of study beginning tonight. And we're still working under the main heading of Israel's ungodliness on the major outline I gave you. It takes in chapters 4 through 13. And we're coming to the section, chapters 9 and 10, which is going to deal with Israel's punishment. Now, as you notice on your outline, in my opinion, in my personal study in preparing this lesson, these two chapters, I think the key verse in all these chapters is really verse number 1 of chapter 9. When God tells Israel to rejoice not. Now, as we build the foundation for this study, when you think about the phrase, why would God tell anyone not to rejoice?
Not pleased.
Not pleased. That's a good... Obviously, if God's not pleased with you, there's no reason to rejoice.
Well, a lot of people rejoice when they're sinning.
Yeah. And obviously, that's not true joy, is it? But yet people take joy. People take joy in that. You know, people joy in all the wrong things. And Israel was here. And I think as we look here in these two chapters, especially at the outset, and really when you look back on our previous chapter, we find that Israel really found joy in their material prosperity, which they attributed to the false gods they worshipped. And again, as we go through these two chapters, we're going to find that they're going to further expand on and explain God's commanding and warning Israel not to rejoice because of what was coming down the line for them. And would there be any reason for them to rejoice knowing that God was about to drop the hammer on them? Now's not the time to rejoice because you got something coming down the line. And so I think the major lesson we're going to find in all of this is that if we are disobedient to God, or if we are unfaithful to Him, there's no reason for us to rejoice, because as Brother Ricky pointed out, God's displeased with us. God is against us. And, His wrath awaits us if we persist in that sinful state. In chapter 9, as we go through our study, as we emphasize verse number 1, the imperative not to rejoice, chapter 9 is going to emphasize you don't rejoice because captivity is coming. And then chapter 10 is the emphasis will be on the coming destruction which would produce the captivity. In other words, God tells Israel, you don't rejoice because you're about to go into captivity, and you better not rejoice because destruction's coming. There's going to be death, the land's going to be destroyed, and the land's going to be left desolate. So listen to me, my stubborn, rebellious people. God is telling Israel, you don't rejoice. And so that's what we're going to emphasize in our study of these two chapters. So we come to chapter 9. As we look under the first main heading, captivity is coming. If someone would, let's go ahead and read this verse. Verse number 1. Who has that? Thank you, Brother Larry. So the main idea in this verse, God is telling Israel, you don't rejoice because you're unfaithful. And again, at the time of Hosea's prophecy, Israel was enjoying a period of temporary prosperity which led to rejoicing. Now, it is possible and plausible, and I didn't put this verse on your outline, so mark in your Bible 2 Kings 15, 19, and 20. It is possible that the Assyrians at this time had lifted their threat against the nation as a result of the Israelite king at the time, Menahem, paying King Pul, who was king of Assyria at the time, tribute money. Again, as we've noted, Israel is instructed not to rejoice as other people rejoice. This joy would not last. And I would suggest they had developed a false sense of security. And certainly there is reason why they were not to rejoice. And what had they done? What had they played? the harlot. They had spiritually prostituted themselves to the idols of the heathen. And again, that's why they were guilty of spiritual adultery. But you also notice that in the same verse that they had accepted the harvest of a harlot's hire for their spiritual prostitution before these false gods. Again, I suggest chapter 2, verse number 12, as a note on your outline, ties into this when Israel acknowledged her prosperity as the reward my lovers have given me. And I think that verse serves as a great commentary on what God is saying here. It is evident that at every recurring harvest season, Israel connected the blessings she received with these supposed protectors, these idols. And so as a result, Israel felt as much pledged to these idols as the harlot is bound to her hire by her paramour, or we might say pimp. Now, on every threshing floor has the idea of the practice that on most of these pagan farms, when you look at the practice, the landowner and workers gave thanks for the harvest at the threshing floor. And in this context, Israel was giving thanks to the idols, along with participating in these ungodly rituals at these threshing floors. And this was an abomination in God's sight. God had warned them, Moses himself had warned them that thou shalt not bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow. For even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Deuteronomy 23:18. And so we find from verse number 1, was there any reason for Israel to rejoice in the spiritual condition she was in? Well, absolutely not. Now let's look at verse number 2, if someone would. Read this. All right, again, thank you, Brother Larry. So the idea here is, Israel, you do not rejoice, for your blessings are going to be removed. Again, on your outline, I tie this passage in with chapter 2 and verse 9, and I would suggest it's parallel in a lot of ways. When you look at the former verse, when God declared He would take away his wine and his corn and his wool and flax. Now, when God says He would take away His things, what does this indicate about the source of these blessings? Where do the blessings that Israel received, and then conversely, where do the blessings we receive come from? God. From God. Every good gift, every perfect gift comes down from whom? The Father of lights, as James puts it. That's a verse everyone needs to remember, is it not there in James 1:17? Remember the source of all that we have been blessed with. It's God. It's not ourselves. It's not any idols. Jehovah God alone was the source of these blessings, not these idols that Israel zealously worshiped. But again, I suggest, or I ask the question: had Israel forgotten the source of these blessings? Has men today forgotten the source of His blessings? Absolutely. That's what happens when God is removed from the picture. And so now God tells him, I'm going to take these away. So Israel, you don't rejoice. Now let's look at the third thing here. Look at the third point here, verses 3 through 9. If someone would, let's go ahead and read this whole section. And God here is going to tell Israel, you don't rejoice, for you're not going to dwell in the land anymore. Someone would, let's go ahead and read these.
They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. They shall not offer wine offering to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto Him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted, for their bread, for their soul shall not come to the house of the Lord. What will you do in the solemn day and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up, Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant void places for their silver and metals shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacle. The day of visitation are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The spirit The watchman of Ephraim was with my God, but the prophet is a snare of a fowler in all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore he shall remember their iniquity, he shall visit their sin.
All right, thank you, Sister Dusty. Again, God's telling them in this section, I'm going to drive you out. Let's look at verse number 3 here, the proclamation. Now, it's interesting to note, whose land did Israel think that the promised land was? They thought it was theirs. But what is the prophet telling them here? Who does the land belong to? Belongs to God. This land is the Lord's land. And he's telling them, you're not going to dwell here anymore. You know, and again, I think the lesson here for everyone to remember is that God owns the land. And does God own all things? Now the question is, why does God own all things? What gives God the right of possession to all things? He made us. Right of creation, exactly. And you think about this here. God had taken the land of Canaan from whom? From the Canaanites and the heathens. And he gave it to Israel. He gave it to his own people. But now, I think the tables are turned. Now he's going to take it away from whom? Going to take it away from his people and give it back. And again, it's interesting to note here, he talks about Israel or Ephraim here. Ephraim stands for Israel. And that he is going to return to Egypt. Now, where was the nation of Israel born? What's that? In Egypt. Exactly, Sister Dusty. We read at the outset of the book of Exodus that Israel became a great nation down in Egypt. Now, were they really going to return to Egypt literally? Exactly, and again, that's what the phrase here is symbolic of. While they were in Egypt, they were in bondage. And so the prophet here is using the idea of returning to Egypt in that sense, as you just pointed out, Sister Dusty, of going back into bondage or slavery. And again, we notice this same phrase used in chapter 8 as well. And of course, the place they would go to in this context would be Assyria. And the treatment their forefathers endured in Egypt would be the treatment they would experience in Assyria. And also notice here the unclean things. As a result of the captivity, Israel would be forced to eat unclean things. That's the only way they would survive. For anything outside of the land was considered unclean. Now they would die in an unclean land. And Amos prophesied of that, as you see on your outline, and that unclean land would be Assyria. And again, this is the consequence of their sins. Notice verses 4 and 5. We see the proclamation here. And so in verses 4 and 5, we see what they had done to the land. In verse number 4, as was read for us, they had polluted the land. And first of all, when we look at this verse, there's something they would not be able to do, and that is what? Come into the house of the Lord. They wouldn't be able to offer sacrifice or acceptable sacrifices unto the Lord. But I suggest even while they were in the land, it was impossible for them to do that as well. Because of what? Failure to repent. They were so attached to their idols. They were too far gone. Their hearts had been hardened due to their sin. Could we say that? You know, there's an old country song that goes, titled Past the Point of Rescue. Could we not say that about Israel here? That they were past the point of rescue due to their stubbornness and impenitence? I think so. You know, the bread of mourners here is the idea of bread and bread that was eaten in mourning for those dead as one sharing their grief with others over sorrow of death. By the law, a dead body and everything related to it, the house where it was and the persons who touched it, were all polluted and unclean, and whatever they touched was considered as defiled. And you had the verses on your outline for personal study. And this would be how their sacrifices were due to their sin. And as a result, their sacrifices were empty and useless as nothing but this bread of mourners. And you also look, the food that they would eat would only be for the satisfying of the appetite and not in communion with Jehovah God. The food they ate, the bread for their soul, would be such that would never be accepted in God's house because it was unclean. The pollution that they would eat was the consequence of their having polluted the land and their souls with sin. And again, Peter talks about sin being as pollution there in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 20 and following. Now, what would they do according to verse number 5? Well, that's the question God asks. And I would suggest they would wonder how they could offer acceptable sacrifices, and yet this would be impossible in captivity. They would be unable to observe the ceremonial observances of the law while in captivity. And I think it's important to note as well here in verse number 5 that their sins would lead them to a complete alienation from God. And there was nothing they could do. And again, the idea of what comes to your mind when you hear the word solemn? Grave, serious. Now, what day could be so grave, so serious that God asks them this question? What are you going to do in this grave, this serious day? It could be. It also could be the day of his wrath upon Israel as well. You could make the case for both. I think in the context, though, it would certainly appear to be the day of his wrath that would be poured out upon them. But who was to blame for their situation? They were. Couldn't blame God because what had God done for them? Delivered them. Could they blame the prophets, such as Hosea? No. What had the prophets done for them?
Warned them a long time.
Warned them some more, and then finally had to pronounce their doom upon them. And again, God did not want that to happen. He wanted them to turn back to Him, as we've emphasized time and again. But because they wouldn't, they had no one to blame but themselves.
They took all the blessings for granted that God gave them.
Exactly. And I think you make a good point, Brother Ricky. I think one of the reasons why Christians fall away is because they take for granted their blessings and who they are. Do we not? And I think at times we forget where we came from sin. And I think Israel forgot where they had came from, Egypt.
In Egypt, they became a nation. They became a people.
Yeah.
But when they're going into this captivity, they lose that. They are no longer a nation.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to see that in chapter 10 especially.
And that's like today, we come out of the world, we become a Christian in the church, and when we leave the church we're back out in the world, we're no longer.
And again, the church is a holy nation. We're part of the greatest nation there is because we belong to God. Yeah. Yes, Susan?
I hung up on that. I'm trying to figure out, is there a reason why Israel is now being referred to as Ephraim? Because instead of being Israel, the promise that this is going to happen, they are now not even being referred to as the nation of one of the 12 sons, but yet...
Part, place for the whole.
Yeah, but they're like being referred to particularly one of the sons that came, or the second generation that came and was actually born and raised in Europe. I mean, in Egypt, home country. But, because Ephraim and Manasseh were from Joseph in Egypt. But all the others were born and had been descendants of the... Is there a reason that name has changed?
Just part, place for the whole. Ephraim being the largest of the 12 tribes used to stand for the whole of the nation. That's about what I would suggest to you there on that. And it's not a new thing, because you see throughout the entire every writing prophet, God uses various names to refer to his people. In fact, in chapter 10, in dealing with the nation, he's going to refer to the capital city of Samaria specifically, which would stand for the nation as well. So it's not a new deal. It's especially prevailing here in the book of Hosea. And
I often wonder, like, Susan, because they talk about Israel, and then like once they'll call them Ephraim.
mhm.
Yeah, he always refers for a reason. And Israel goes back to the promise of, when he kills, here is your new name, you're going to have the descendant, this is the promise that's coming.
Mhm.
But then Ephraim isn't even one of the 12 sons. He is the son of a son.
Well, look at
who is
chapter.
not even born in the
Well, go
kingdom.
back to chapter 7, verse 1. When you look at the 12 tribes, here we have Samaria used again, where God talks about when he would have healed Israel, then the iniquity or lawlessness of Ephraim was discovered, and then he also talks about the wickedness of Samaria. Now, Samaria was the capital city, and Ephraim, if we are correct in saying that it was the largest of the 12 tribes, these two locations, Ephraim and Samaria, are used to depict the universal corruption of the nation as a whole.
But is there any particular reason that it's one of...
What tribe was Jeroboam? Because he's the one that started with the sin.
I think Jeroboam may have been of the tribe of Ephraim. He was chosen by God to lead the revolt against Rehoboam. And remember, for the most part, to the south, which tribe was the royal tribe? Judah. All the kings in the south were from the tribe of Judah. Which tribe did Christ come from? Judah. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken,
So he's the one that took them away from worshiping at Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Whatever was, I can't ever remember if it's Rehoboam or Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. Let me look this up right quick.
I'm Googling it right now. A member of the tribe of Ephraim of Zerahiah. His mother was named Zeruiah was the widow.
So that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense, does it not? From which tribe did all this trouble get started? Ephraim. Who was the first king of the divided kingdom to the north? Jeroboam, son of Nebat, from the tribe of Ephraim. So that probably that serves as a possible explanation, does it not?
Or even Judah, the line came from Judah. Judah was the brother that stood up to say, don't do this to Benjamin, don't do this to Joseph.
Right.
And he was always the one that spoke against.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, he got the blessing of that was the one. Because, in the past, it's always the firstborn. He wasn't the firstborn.
Right. So I think that explains it, does it not? Because the problem of idol worship in the kingdom, in the northern kingdom, started with Jeroboam. And how much trouble did it cause Israel from that time forward? It carried them into captivity. Does that explain things, Susan? Does that sort of...
Well, no, I still find it interesting about just the whole name reason.
Mm-hmm.
And which tribe was it that did not fulfill their land promise?
Well, the Levites didn't have any particular land because they were the priestly tribe, but even though God had given them specific cities in each tribe to dwell in.
But one of the tribes from the east,
Two tribes didn't cross over.
right, they were supposed to, two tribes.
I think it was the Benjamites and the Reubens, Benjamin and Reuben, but don't quote me on that right now.
Yeah, two tribes were supposed to cross and help them finish fighting. And they did for the first two battles, but then they went back. And so because of that, the land promise was never validated or something.
Well, the land promise was, because every good thing that God had promised to Israel came to pass, as Joshua put it.
And in Joshua 24, he gives the warning that what they've done in Hosea is going to happen.
Right. And certainly Moses did as well in the book of Deuteronomy. He told them if they worshipped idols, you're going to be taken away from this land. But I think the fact that, Jeroboam was of Ephraim, and he was the one who introduced idolatry at Dan and Bethel. I think, it's my opinion after this discussion, I believe that is why throughout the book, Ephraim is used. That a possible explanation? I could be wrong. I don't know, but I think that's probably one of the best explanations as to why God would do it. Again, as we look at verses 6 through 9, as we see the punishment, and that was an excellent question. That was really a good thought question, Susan.
Another interesting thing here is the son of Aaron died and was buried in Ephraim.
Eleazar?
Yeah. It's the very last verse in Joshua 24.
Interesting.
I didn't.
So Ephraim was a prominent tribe as well, which would also explain another reason why God would choose to use Ephraim to stand for the nation, because of its prominence. And that's another good piece of evidence to suggest that. In verse 6, though, verses 6 through 9 here deals with the punishment that was to come. In verse 6, it's really pronounced and pictured. Again, God uses the figure of Egypt. Now, why would God continue to use the figure of Egypt?
That's where he brought them out of.
What brought them out of? Israel would be very familiar with Egypt, would they not? So what better illustration to convey to them, you're going into captivity and you're going back to going into captivity, than by using Egypt? And that would impress upon them what they were about to go through yet again, slavery. Again, Memphis here. Now, this isn't Memphis, Tennessee, obviously. Memphis here was a prominent city in Egypt, and it represented a burying ground, I believe, for their luxuries. And as we've talked about, the blessings they took for granted would be removed, and would Israel learn to appreciate the blessings? Would they finally learn to appreciate what they had? No. And that begs the question, will men today ever learn to appreciate what they've been blessed with? You'd like to think we would, but again, because of our... What's that?
Some of them won't in this life.
Some of them won't in this life.
Things are going too well.
Yeah. Well, look at the rich man in Luke 16. Look at the rich farmer in Luke 12. He didn't appreciate those blessings. He said, I got this myself. And well, look what happened to him. God called him a fool. And he lost his soul. And now, if Israel had lived in accordance to God's will, well, they would have remained in the land and continued to enjoy these blessings, would they have not? But instead, they chose to rebel and be impenitent. And as a result, they would be driven out where their living conditions would be deplorable. In fact, the ivory couches in Samaria would be replaced by beds of thorns and nettles. And certainly that depicts the unpleasant living conditions they would experience in Assyria. Now, verses 7 through 9 really give us the picture of the punished, that would be Israel, in their behavior. Now, the first part of verse 7, the days of visitation. Now, what does this term imply? Punishment. God's going to visit them. It's denoting the time of punishment. But also notice here as well, we have a second phrase, the days of recompense. What's that? Payback. Purpose of the punishment. And again, God's going to pay Israel back for her sinfulness, is he not? And again, on your outline, I gave you the account in 2 Kings chapter 17, which serves as the historical explanation as to why they were going to be punished as severely as they would be. And that ties in with the time frame of Hosea right there. So Israel, and before time is up, here in verse 7, Israel would recognize, and again, they had been beguiled by false prophets, had they not, in their history? And so God here is telling them, here in verse 7, the prophet is a fool. Well, is he talking about Hosea here? Well, obviously not. Hosea wasn't a fool to God. But rather, God here is talking about those false prophets who had given Israel a false sense of hope, who had promised peace when there was none, who promised hope when there was no hope, short of genuine repentance. And of course, their message was, we're okay, nothing to worry about. And certainly as a result of listening to these individuals, Israel was led further away from God, deeper into lawlessness and greater hatred for truth and righteousness. And of course, as a result, these individuals would be proven to be fools. And again, the deceitfulness of the false prophet and the iniquity of the nation go hand in hand. The blind led the blind, and both fell into the pit. They both fell into the ditch, as it were.
You could take that too, it's like the people were saying the prophet was a fool and the spiritual man is mad.
Yeah.
They weren't paying attention to him, but then they would know they weren't.
That's exactly right. There is that application as well. They probably viewed Hosea as a fool, and when he was pronouncing these words of punishment, the inhabitants were probably said, "You're just mad, Hosea. You're just plain crazy." And so there is that application as well. I think that's an excellent point, Sister Dusty. And certainly a lot of the prophets were viewed by the people as crazy, were they not?
They didn't pay any attention to him, so
Yeah. Read the book of Amos and see how Amos was viewed by the king's court there. That's an interesting discussion there. They looked upon Amos disdainfully and, with the idea of, "You're just a farmer, Amos." But I digress. All right. We'll put a peg there and we will pick up with verse 8 in 2 weeks.